31 years ago this year, John Vincent Atanasoff visited the Computer Museum in Boston. It was November 1980. He presented an evening lecture about his work and his career, and you can imagine a lecture hall that looked a lot like this, filled with people who are a lot like us, and coming face to face with a pioneer. So imagine yourself as part of that evening, in the opening few moments of John Atanasoff's lecture, introduced by a clearly excited and enthusiastic Gordon Bell.
Dr. John Atanasoff is going to tell his story of the invention of the first electronic digital computer. Dr. Atanasoff was an applied mathematician and physicist working in the physics departments at Iowa State, and I think at the time working on analog techniques for solving Laplace's equation and also doing some statistics using punch cards. In about 1936 to 37, he really abandoned the whole idea of using analog techniques for computation, and by 1938 had worked out the details of memory and logic using an electrostatic drum. Then in 39 he went on to design this machine for solving 30 simultaneous linear equations. He then showed this work to Mauchly in June of 41. In essence, he has embedded the idea of the analog in what he called the impulse digital calculator, at least there. But if I spend any more time introducing him, I will begin to tell his story, and he's going to tell it better than I can anyway. So this is indeed an honor to have with us Dr. Atanasoff. Thank you.
After months of work and study, I went to the office again one evening, but it looked as if nothing would happen. I was extremely distraught. And then I did something that I did in those days, but I've had to stop lately. I got in my automobile and started to drive. I drove hard so I would have to give my attention to driving and I wouldn't have to worry about my problems. And whenever and once in a while I would commence to think about my efforts to build a computer, and I didn't want to do that, so I'd drive harder so I wouldn't. Here, I drove towards the east. I was driving a Ford V8 and with a south wind heater. I don't suppose you know what a south wind heater is. Pretty warm, but the night was very cold. It was in the middle of the winter, 1937 and 38. When I finally came to Earth, I was crossing the Mississippi River, 189 miles from my desk. You couldn't get a drink in Iowa in those days, but I was crossing into Illinois. I looked ahead and there was a light. Of course, it was it. And I stopped and got out and went in and hung up my coat. I remember that coat. And sat down at the desk and got a drink. And then I noticed that my mind was very clear and sharp. And I knew what I wanted to think about, and I went right to work on it and worked for 3 hours, and then got in my car and drove slowly back to Ames. And I had made 4 decisions in that evening in the Illinois Roadhouse. Use electricity and electronics. That meant, of course, vacuum tubes in those days. Use base 2 in spite of custom for economy. Use condensers, but regenerate to avoid lapses. Compute by direct action, not by enumeration.
You can see I've aged, but my speaking ability hasn't improved at all. Anyway, in looking at this, I believe the value of video is demonstrated here. And I regret to say I didn't learn that lesson till about maybe a decade ago. We didn't capture all of the wonderful lectures from the 15 pioneers, of which this was the second pioneering lecture on computing, which included the people from Colossus and ENIAC and a number of the other pre-computing, pre-stored program computer efforts. So he was really the second pioneering effort that preceded of the series that preceded the stored program computer. I'd like to say that we now have the full tape, and I think it runs about 70 minutes, and that's up on the YouTube website, our YouTube channel, and I encourage you to do that. But in this, I think you get a feeling how charming Dr. Atanasoff was. I enjoyed interacting with him, and I was one that I'd say encouraged him to come out of his shell and write his story in the annals of computing history, because if he didn't write his story, then who's going to do it? What we're going to hear tonight is her story. So we'll contrast a history with a herstory. And leading that effort will be John and Jane talking about her story. Thank you.
So let's start with just some process questions. Can we do that?
Okay, sure, anything.
What led you to write this book?
Well, I had written a book in a series before. Sometimes people, publishers call me up and they want me to participate in a series. And usually the definition of the series is this group of people or these people are important for some reason. And in this case, the series was about American inventors. And they wanted me to write a book about Norman Borlaug. And, you know, hybrid seed, I just couldn't get it. I really didn't care anymore. And in addition, Borlaug was then still alive, so I knew I would have to contend with him. And so I said to the guy who called me up, well, do you know who invented the computer? And he said, no. And I said, well, I'll do that one. I mean, I really couldn't believe they would put, you know, Norman Borlaug in, but not Atanasoff. So that's what got me started on it. And since I had been at Iowa State for a long time, and since the father of my two daughters had written an article for the Iowa State Historical Magazine about Atanasoff, I was familiar with the story. But my goal was not to say, okay, this is the first guy. And there are tons and tons of books out there, all of which say, no, my guy is first, no, my guy is first. But as I kept going on my research, I realized that it was much more interesting not who was first, but how the stories wove together, and also how the personalities of the inventors compared and contrasted to one another. And eventually I had about 8 characters, and they were true characters with a capital C. They were a novelist's dream, I have to say.
Did you
And I
expect
really
that
enjoyed
going
that.
into it? Did you know that you were dealing with these kind of huge personalities?
Well, I knew that Atanasoff had been extremely dynamic and energetic, and so I knew that he had a big personality of a certain kind of maybe classic American go-getter, do-it-yourself sort of thing. But I wasn't familiar with the other characters at all. And they were not only entirely different from one another, but also extremely distinct in the way that they went about things and the circumstances that they had to put up with. And so I loved comparing and contrasting how they went about things and what they had to deal with. I finally said that the story was like 4 separate movies running simultaneously in 4 different movie theaters. And they were all different styles of movie. And obviously the English movie about the Colossus was this kind of war movie, you know, but there were, that fascinated me too.
I want to talk about that and the way that you've interwoven these stories together.
Okay.
But let me ask you just though, before I do that, can you talk a little bit about the challenges of a non-technical writer writing about a very technical subject?
Well, it's sort of like horseback riding. If you start early enough, then you master it and you don't forget it. But if you wait until you're in your late 50s, the details come and go.
Yeah.
And that's why you need tech support. I
Yeah,
mean,
right.
I did know what binary computation was. And I won't go any further than that. But you know, I knew that because of 8th grade math, not because I learned it afresh. But so the technical part was difficult. But that's why I got John and Bob to help me. And I knew that I was going to need that.
And then you dove right in.
I dove right in, yeah. The best way to write a book, and any kind of book, is just to write. And to know that whatever mistakes you're making at any given point, you can come back and correct those. The book does not have to leave the house before you let it out. And so you can move forward, not necessarily with confidence, but with a kind of impetus, even though you know that you're making mistakes. And then somebody comes along and corrects them, you know, either your editor or you at a later date or whatever.
Who picked the title?
Publisher.
The publisher picked the title. And did you know, I mean, controversy never hurts when it comes to selling a book, and certainly The Man Who Invented the Computer is a controversial title to put out there. Did you know when that title was being picked and this is the way the book was going to go out, that it was going to be controversial?
I knew the whole book was going to be controversial no matter what the title was.
Okay.
I mean, I could have entitled it, Maybe This Guy Invented the Computer, you know, and a lot of people would have objected to every word in that title.
Yeah.
There was just no way to avoid it, you know. So I tried to address the issues of the controversy, and I tried to pose my question, which is not who was the guy who invented the first computer, but how did my computer, which at that time was a MacBook, how did this computer get to me? And so, but I still get emails from people who say, but he didn't invent the first computer. And you know, obviously this is a person who has not read the book and doesn't know that that wasn't the question that I posed.
But that is how you open the book. It says you first began this journey by simply asking, how did this thing on my desk get to my desk? So let's talk about Atanasoff the Man.
It's an 11-inch MacBook Air now, though.
An 11-inch MacBook Air for the Apple fansters out there. Let's talk about Atanasoff the Man.
Okay.
So clearly, eccentric, brilliant, driven, not widely known in American history. What was it about Atanasoff once you got into this that you found so fascinating as a subject of a book like this?
Well, one of the things is, one of the things that I looked into was theories of creativity. And one of the books that I read defined a creative person as a problem seeker. And when you read about Atanasoff's early life, he was the kind of kid who would fix something, but then he would go on to improve that thing, so that to improve maybe the design of that thing, whatever it was. So it wasn't good enough for him just to bring it back to the way that it was left at the factory or something. He wanted to fix it. So instead of a problem solver, he was a problem seeker. And that seems to be the way his mind works. And that's the way a creative person's mind works. It looks at the whole system of whatever the problem is, and it organizes that system. And then it asks questions of that system that cause that system to sort of reveal itself and then maybe to be improved by the problem seeker. And obviously, as a novelist, I'm aware of that way of thinking. You know, a novelist is a person who has never met a novel he didn't think he could make better. You know, a painter goes to a painting, stands in front of a beautiful painting, and says, "Oh shit, I'll never do that well." A novelist reads War and Peace and says, "You know what he really should have done." And so there's that quality that I was familiar with of, you know, this is pretty good, whatever it is, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, King Lear. But let's just tweak it a little bit to make it say slightly different things. So I recognize that.
I think you just made this amazing connection between writing a novel and being an engineer.
Well, there's a lot to being in writing. There's a lot of engineering in novel writing.
Yeah.
Not so much in poetry writing, but in novel writing, yeah.
So here's a guy who is a problem seeker, and the problem that he has involves his studies in quantum physics. He's trying to do this incredibly complicated work, solving all of this by hand, frustrated, just can't deal with that complexity.
And also he was a teacher.
anymore.
I think that's an important aspect because he was by profession seeking problems and ways to solve them for his students. And so because he had students, he was constantly having to explain what to do, how to do it, how it might work. And so his mind was constantly working in that way because of being a teacher too. So one of the things he did at Iowa State all through the early part of the 30s was kind of deploy his students to think about things. And I think that was an important part of how he got organized, you know, how he organized his mind to grasp the problem and then have it come to him.
And he saw his students struggling with the same thing he was struggling with.
Absolutely.
He even says at one point, the last thing I wanted to do was invent something.
Absolutely.
He really didn't seek to
Yes, that really
invent
struck
the
me.
device.
It was like a tragic moment in his life. You know, I have to do this thing, and I don't want to do it. I'm interested in other things. And I also think it was really, we have to remember that in 1937 in Ames, Iowa, there was no sense that the ideas that he needed, or that the invention of a computer would be a fruitful thing. He didn't necessarily know that he could invent it, and he didn't necessarily know that it would work. And he didn't necessarily know that it would contribute to his academic career. And so he knew there was a really strong chance that he was just heading down a dead end. And that it wasn't a dead end is a tribute to his brilliance. But, you know, we all quail when we see that there must be something done that we weren't thinking we had to do, but we have to do it, and it's a huge project.
And as it turns out, as you describe him, he's also someone who would undertake a project and finish it and then move on. It's as if
that seems to be the case, yeah.
he wasn't interested necessarily in anything that he invented, because this wasn't the only thing that he designed in his life.
Well, two things struck me about him as a creative person. One was that it was the problem itself that fascinated him. And the other one was his inherent frugality. I mean, John Vincent Jr. is here. And one of the stories, and you can correct me if this is wrong, but as I remember, one of the stories was that when you were a baby, you lived in the basement of the family home that John Vincent Sr. was building all through an Ames, Iowa winter. You know, so that's how his mind worked. Let's do things one step at a time. If the baby has to live in the basement while we're building the house, well, baby has to live in the basement, you know. If we have to build the breadboard computer, which is this big, in order to understand how it works, and then make the next step to the differential equation solver, which is this big, in order to understand what it works, and then maybe the next step is to the one that's as big as the poster there, then that's how his mind works, step by step. Let's be as frugal in every way as we can, and let's master this thing before we go on to the next thing.
And he finally decides that invention is ultimately the only solution here.
Yeah.
He finds Barry.
Well, you know, I had to laugh when I was reading, because he did fiddle with an IBM calculator, and he did improve it. And it made the IBMers really mad. And he found this out later, you know. So they were very proprietary about their equipment. And they shouldn't have been. They should have called him up and said, come on, we'll hire you. And that's the difference between their way of doing things and his way of doing things. He brought Barry in and said, blah, 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 blah. And I'm sure Barry said, oh, we could do that. And they were able to collaborate very fruitfully. But that's because they weren't feeling proprietorial about the thing they were doing. They were just interested in it.
So let's leave them for a moment. Mm-hmm. This is about 1939 or so.
Yeah.
And let's turn to the other figures that you cover, because you really do a romp through history of all these incredible people who were more or less working on the same thing at exactly the same moment.
Well, you know, when I started out, I decided that maybe personality-wise, if Atanasoff was over here in the kind of hyper-dynamic, hyper-masculine world, we have Alan Turing over here. That they were quite opposite. And where Atanasoff was fixing the family automobile when he was, I believe it was 13 or 12, Turing couldn't tie his shoes or even get them on the right feet by the time he was 5 or 6. So here were two guys, both essential to the history of computing, whose minds worked in completely different ways. And it wasn't that Turing had no engineering in his background. His mother's family was full of engineers. But what I finally decided was that the poor little boy, every time he lifted a tool, somebody took it out of his hand and said, that's not worthy of you. You know, they sent him to the Sherburne School, which is also where Evelyn Waugh and Alec Waugh and those people who were born at the same time. So I was familiar with the Sherburne School. It was a very strict school. And Turing was terribly teased. He was put under the floorboards of the dormitory at least once a year by the other children. He would try to build something and stick it on the windowsill, and it would get thrown away. I mean, it was really a sad thing, because he clearly had the desire to make stuff. But because he was educated in a certain way, he wasn't allowed to make stuff. And here was Atanasoff in the middle of Florida, required to make stuff in order to survive. So I thought they were quite an interesting contrast.
Well, and after you introduce us to Atanasoff in the beginning of the book, Turing is the very first figure that you talk about. Is it because of that
Yeah, it was because
duality?
they're so in such contrast to one another. But then the third person in the troika is clearly Konrad Zuse, who is the only one who wrote his own autobiography, and it's quite interesting to read, and I recommend it. You can still find it around. And Zuse's earliest memories weren't of either making things or thinking things. They were of perceiving things, and his mind seems to have worked sort of around patterns and design. And he did become an inventor, but he became an inventor because he liked the idea of sort of the way things worked. But he is truly an oddball too. I mean, here is a person who is doing his computer all through the 1930s, late 1930s into the 1940s. And bombs are dropping all around him, and the big thing he's worried about is whether the computer is going to work when it's demonstrated, you know.
And he's foraging for parts
Yes.
in the ruins of
Yes.
the
Well, not
bombed-out
only is
areas
he
of
foraging
his-
for parts, but he's foraging for people to help him.
Right.
And the only people that are available are women, misfits, and criminals. And so he makes good use of both. You know, one of his programmers was blind, and that's when Zuse realized that Braille was a form of code. So he put him to good use. One day after there had been a bombing, Zuse needed I think it was a piece of copper wire, a length of copper wire. So he sent a couple of his helpers out into the street to where the streetcar line had been bombed, and they clipped a piece and came running back. But the most, you know, and the great thing about Zuse is he has a wonderful sense of humor, and you're reading this book and you just cannot believe that you're laughing at the things that are happening. But it's because he sees them in such a sort of amazed way. And I think the thing that, probably the incident that is the most dramatic, there's a couple of them, but one time the computer, I think it's the Z4, is in the basement of a building in Berlin, and he's going to work at it. And as he's running up the stairs, running down the stairs, he hears an incoming bomb, and he steps to one side. The bomb hits the staircase, blows it up, and then he realizes that that's all over, so he continues on down to the computer. You know, he's much more interested in whether the computer is going to work than whether he's going to die. But maybe the most dramatic thing was when they realized they had to get the computer out of Berlin. Berlin was falling, and the Reich was collapsing. And it was in a basement, and they managed to get it on the elevator, but the elevator had no power, and the way that you'd get the elevator up, you had to pull on a lever that just turned the pulley that got the elevator out of the basement. They had to pull on it just 1/2 or 1/4 of a turn at a time. And they did get it out, and they had a truck, and Zuse had sort of a fairy godfather. He didn't know where he came from, but he managed to get them a truck, and they managed to get the Z4 into the truck. And then every time they came to a checkpoint, this man would say that they had the V4 in there. And everybody knew what the V4 was, or thought they knew what the V4 was. And so because they had the V4 in there, they let them through. And they managed to get to southern Germany and then to Austria and save the Z4.
The Z4. So you've got Zuse and you've got Atanasoff. Let's turn back to Turing and the team at Bletchley Park, because that thread is one that runs very much in parallel with these other stories. And you bring Neumann and you bring Tommy Flowers and the whole group into the forefront at that point.
I think, you know, everybody's heard of Turing. He's the most famous. Probably the least famous is Tommy Flowers. And Flowers did say that the Colossus would never have been built without him, and I think for several reasons. But the one specific reason was that Tommy Flowers worked for the British Telephone Company before the war. And in September of 1939, he had done an experiment using vacuum tubes to see if they could use vacuum tubes to transmit the telephone signal more quickly. And it had worked, and it had been his idea. And he went to Germany. And when the Germans attacked Poland and the British declared war, he was in Germany. And he managed to get out with 2 hours to spare. As soon as he realized that they were at war, he headed for the border. And he managed to get out with 2 hours to spare. And he said if he had not managed to get out, nobody back in England knew enough about vacuum tubes to build the Colossus. And the problem with, there's a wonderful book actually that's really worth reading. It's called Colossus, for those of you who haven't read it. It came out in 2006. And in the war, Turing and the others who worked on code breaking for the Enigma, that was really essential early in the war because that broke naval codes. And if they hadn't been able to break the naval codes, Britain would have been cut off and been without food and resources. But they did manage to break the naval codes. The Tunny codes, or the codes that were put out by the Lawrence Schusselstotts, were the Army codes, and they were the high command codes. And so as the Allies got their act together and converged and made up their minds that they were going to invade, they had to be breaking those Army codes. And they were much more complicated codes. And I think the moment in the book that always brings a tear to my eye is actually that in early June of 1944, everybody was getting ready for the Normandy invasion. And Eisenhower was sitting with his high command. They had rain, bad weather had stalled them for a few days. They had intended to go on the 1st. And someone ran in, and they had the first code that the Colossus had broken. And what it said was that that the Germans had decided that the push toward Normandy was a feint, and that really the Allies were going to the south. And so they should not, Rommel, I believe it was, decided this, and then the German forces were ordered to stay to the south rather than to move toward Normandy. And was that the key moment in the history of the Second World War? Well, there were a lot of key moments, but that was certainly an important one. And that was Colossus.
That was Colossus.
And that was the first code that was broken.
So let's, you've got on the stage now, you've got Turing and Flowers and Neumann, you've got Zusa. There are some others who have to enter the frame.
Yes.
Eckert and Mauchly and von Neumann. But before we bring them in, let's talk about the work that had to go on with the ABC and what actually happened to bring that machine to life. So Atanasoff has this very eager young graduate student, Clifford Berry. They raise $650 in grant money through the university.
That was a lot for Iowa State.
Which was spoken like a true University of Iowa alum. And so they set out to build a machine.
Well, first they took, how many vacuum tubes were on the breadboard, John? Say that again? 7 dual trials. 7, okay. So first they got a little board, it's out there, and they just tried it to see if it was going to work. And they had that built by the fall of '38, I believe. that right? Or 39, the fall of 39.
39, yeah.
And it worked like a charm. And so Clifford Berry was from Gladbrook, which is a little catty corner northeast of Ames. And he was a extremely calm and congenial person who had been an Eagle Scout not too long before he was building the computer, but whose father had been killed by a disgruntled worker. And his mother, even though the father was killed, the mother put together the money to send Barry to Iowa State. And Barry's job was to build the thing, and also I think was to sort of understand what Atanasoff was getting at and to put it together. I think they consulted a lot, but I think Barry did a lot sort of thinking on his own. And so he got the angle iron and he built, as you can see out there, he built what looks like a desk.
Mm-hmm.
And they had that together by 40, I think they had it together by the fall of 1940. But they were still fiddling with it and working with it.
So then
The sad thing was that when Atanasoff was looking for a space to build it, they sent him to the basement of the physics building, which was good in some ways because it was a constant temperature and rather cool. But it was bad in other ways because it was just a kind of a little basement. At the time when they built it, there were no rooms there, and subsequently rooms were built. And the doorways of the room was smaller than the computer, smaller than the ABC.
And that's how it happened.
Yeah, this is life at Iowa State.
Yeah.
I mean, I love Iowa State. I'll tell an Iowa State story. When I first got to Iowa State, I was pregnant with my second child, and sometime in September, when I was probably 9 months along, I walked across the campus to go to the main building to do something in the office. And I got there at about 10 minutes to 12, closed up tight. I looked at my watch. I said, boy, it's not even noon yet. And I pounded on the door, no answer, pounded on the door, no answer. Finally, I'd pounded a long time, and the door to the office opened. It opened like this. And one of the secretaries peeked out at me. And I said, I need to do blah, blah, blah. And she said, the office is closed. And I said, well, it's not even noon yet. And she said, this is Iowa State. We do things differently here. So the office was closed for lunch at between 10 of 12 and 1 and 10. You know, I said, I'm 9 months pregnant. I'm coming in. And I opened the door. But that's what, you know, that's part of the reason I wrote Moo, because Iowa State had these wonderful sort of peculiarities and eccentricities, and that's Iowa State.
So these eccentrics, inventors, prove out their concept. They build this device. It's December 1940.
Yes, and one of
And-
the things that they did, you know, when Atanasoff went east, one of the things he did was look up every place he could think of where there might be information about copywriting, things that were built.
And they're documenting this very
Idea-
They're
They're
as they're
documenting
building
it. They wrote a description of it that was 35 pages long. He is going. I think he went to the, the place where I can't remember the name of it now, where the patent office to check and see if anything was being patented. Nothing was being patented. He could not find a single thing that was like this, and I think he was a little amazed, but also thrilled. You know, he probably had many different conflicting feelings about this.
And he goes to a conference in December 1940 in Philadelphia, and he goes to a lecture. There's a bright young engineer giving a lecture in this same area, John Mauchly. He hears Mauchly talk about his ideas, very similar in the way of design and sort of the theory that Mauchly is working on in his work. They meet at the end of the
Well,
conference.
he runs up afterwards.
And he runs up and
describes
says
what
to
he's got.
Mauchly, he's very excited because suddenly he feels like he's hearing someone who's got a very similar set of ideas, and he wants to talk to Mauchly about it, and they begin to exchange ideas. Can you take it from there?
Well, they talked about it then, and Mauchly asked if he could come and see the ABC, and Atanasoff said yes. And so,
And so Mauchly drives
so in
from,
June, he drove, bringing his son to Ames, and he was there, I think for 5 days. I think that's how long he was there. And he talked to Barry, he talked to Atanasoff, he read the 35-page document. He asked if he could take the 35-page document back with him. And Laura, Atanasoff's wife, was a little suspicious of how much John was telling him. She's an interesting figure, too, because according to some sources, Mauchly didn't say he was bringing a child, and he just showed up with his son and handed him over to Laura, who had plenty of children of her own.
I think that child could have been here tonight.
Could have been, yeah. And I think she was more cautious. I think that Atanasoff was so thrilled that finally somebody saw the possibilities of his idea that he was quite open about everything. And I think Laura was a little more cautious, and she also noticed that Mauchly was staying up at night and apparently reading the 35-page description and all of that. And so when Mauchly left, Laura, she cautioned Atanasoff and said, maybe you should just button your lip a little bit. But he hadn't. And
he didn't let Mauchly take the copy of
he
the
didn't let him
documentation.
take the 35-page. He had 5 copies of the 35-page description, and he didn't allow Mauchly to take the one with him.
So Mauchly goes back to Philadelphia. 1942, Atanasoff goes east to work at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory. He leaves Iowa State having been assured by the university that they would seek a patent
Yes,
on the ABC,
yes,
and trusting that that patent application was going to be filed and that would all occur, he goes off to work in the war effort.
yes.
He and Mauchly meet again.
Yes, Mauchly showed up at the Naval Ordnance Lab several times, chatted. I gather just that part of Mauchly's personality was that he was quite sociable and talkative and enthusiastic and easy to get along with and talk to, and the sort of person who you want to talk to.
Yeah.
And so I think that Atanasoff was busy, and he was glad to see him, and Mauchly would ask him this or that question about his ideas about computing.
And so meanwhile at the Moore School, here's Mauchly and Eckert, eventually joined by John von Neumann.
I think this is an interesting thing. When Mauchly returned from Ames, he went to a summer program at the Moore School that was about computing, and Eckert was there, and they connected then. And then they began then they began to put together their ideas, and they wrote up a description. This part I'm a little, I can see it on the page, but I can't quite remember. But they wrote up one description. Nobody was interested. The description got thrown away. And then there was this problem of calculating firing tables, at what angle.
Right.
do you raise the weapon in order to hit the target?
Yep.
And there were scads and scads and scads and scads of mathematically minded young women who were calculating these by hand.
Human computers.
Yeah. And they realized that they could build this. And they were building it partly on a computer idea that was already at the Moore School. But that person had left to go to the Army. And so they concocted another description of what they could do. And this time they got funding for it. And they were put in, the person that was put in charge of them, the Army person who was put in charge of them, was Herman Goldstein, who was a mathematician in the Army. And Goldstein was standing on a platform in, I think it was in Philadelphia, on a subway platform, a train platform, I guess. And he saw John von Neumann cross the platform. And he knew what a great mathematician von Neumann was, and he went up and introduced himself. And von Neumann just sort of was about to brush him off when Goldstein said he was working on a computer project. And immediately von Neumann, who was at this point involved in the calculations for the bomb dropping the bombs in Japan, calculations of how high off the ground the bombs would have to explode in order to do maximum damage. And he knew how difficult these calculations were, and all the calculations surrounding the development of the atom bomb had been very difficult. So he was quite interested in this idea of the computer. And so Goldstein brought von Neumann in to show him ENIAC. And von Neumann came back and forth fairly often. And von Neumann was quite brilliant. He also couldn't screw in a light bulb, according to his wife, although he could fix a zipper. But he had a wonderful grasp of, even if he couldn't fix anything, he had a wonderful grasp of how things meshed and what they meant. And the biographer that I read of von Neumann said that the characteristic of his mind, apart from sociability, was that he could systematize and see the importance of a thing that the people who were working on that thing didn't quite understand. And so that was, so he saw ENIAC and said, oh.
And understood
And
the importance of
understood,
it
yeah.
and the potential.
Yeah.
I want to go back for a minute to, there were repeated visits between Mauchly and Atanasoff, where Mauchly would make his way from Philadelphia to Washington to meet with Atanasoff. And you describe those at some length in the book. And I don't want to talk about the visits as much as how carefully documented were all of these interactions between Mauchly and Atanasoff, and where did the record of these visits and all of this interaction between them get put down?
Mauchly's visit to Ames is pretty well documented because a lot of people saw him doing things and with hands on the computer and all of that. I believe it was just Atanasoff who said, Mauchly came to visit, Mauchly came to visit, Mauchly came to visit. Whether he remembered exactly how many times, I don't know.
But it was Atanasoff's recollection.
Yeah. And he
And
also
did that come out in the
remembered,
court documents? Is that primarily the way that Atanasoff's account of all of these visits was made public?
well, I used both Tamara Burton's book, who's Atanasoff's granddaughter, and Mullen and Scott.
Molinoff, yeah.
Yeah, what's his first name?
Clark.
Clark Mollenhoff's book. And Mollenhoff had a lot of interviews with Atanasoff. And there was one time when Eckert came to visit too. And according to Tamara Burton's book, there was one time when von Neumann came to visit too, that he came and chatted up Atanasoff too about the computer.
So let's skip ahead just a bit. Let's just, we will know the ENIAC existed.
Okay.
We'll know that the UNIVAC, the Eckert and Mauchly company was founded by Eckert and Mauchly, and the UNIVAC came into the market and ultimately became part of Sperry Rand. And so now we're in the late 1950s, and the patent litigation begins, because now suddenly Sperry Rand is going to begin asserting these rights to the patents that Eckert and Mauchly had received on electronic computing.
Well, the first people to approach Atanasoff and ask him about his projects, project at Iowa State, were from IBM. The man was a man named A.J. Etienne. And he approached Atanasoff and then disappeared. And that seemed to be because IBM decided the best way to go was just to buy in to the rights for ENIAC. So that was the first little indication, I think, for Atanasoff that something was going on, and that when he was asked to come and visit and look at ENIAC at the end of the war, and he looked at it, and it was so hugely different from the ABC. And Mauchly had kept saying to him when he would meet up with him, well, what we're doing is not at all like what you did. And when he saw ENIAC, he said, oh, he must be telling me the truth. It doesn't look anything like what I did. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I think that he put it out of his mind. He was a successful businessman. He was on to new projects, you know. And I think AJ, when Etienne showed up, he thought something was up, but then, you know, Etienne disappeared, and that was that, you know. And so but it was that was the first little flutter of something going on. Mm-hmm. Now, part of the reason that things got going with the breaking of the patent had to do not with Atanasoff, but with Barry. And I can't remember exactly the name of the person. There was a man who was writing about the history of the computer. He was writing a book about the history of the computer. He happened to be in Ames, and one of his neighbors happened to have seen the ABC and known Barry. And this man who was writing the computer book investigated this, and he discussed it with Barry, and he decided that there had been this predecessor to ENIAC. So it was actually through Clifford Barry that the first sort of entry into the culture of what the importance was the ABC.
And it became apparent then to everyone involved that there was a conflict, potentially.
Well, yeah.
And so the patent litigation begins, and it.
But there was a conflict. You know, it was apparent to. It was, to me, you know, von Neumann was an interesting person, and he, to me, is a pivotal character here. Because when it came time to describe ENIAC and prepare to go on to the next step, von Neumann and Hermann Goldstein wrote up a lengthy description of what they had done, what everybody had done, not just them, but what everybody had done. And Hermann Goldstein wrote it and rewrote it, and von Neumann put his name on it. And they passed out and sent around at least 200 or 300
that
copies.
paper circulated very widely.
In Europe and in America. And so when Mauchly and Eckert decided a little bit later than that, you know, they questioned the description, and Goldstein said, oh, it's just an internal document so that we know what we're doing. And then when Eckert and Mauchly sort of woke up and said, oh boy, we got to get our own document together, they put together a description of what they'd been doing on ENIAC and what their ideas were. And Herman Goldstein, since he was still the boss and it was still wartime, stamped it top secret. So the following spring, when Eckert and Mauchly were ready to leave and to go invent their machine and begin a business around it, von Neumann brought a patent lawyer with him and to the meeting, and the patent lawyer said, well, you know, because the von Neumann description was so widely circulated, it's not really, those ideas in that description aren't really patentable. And von Neumann, according to his biographer, went, oh dear, well, obviously, someone like von Neumann knew exactly what he was doing. And my view is that von Neumann was in many ways, and I have no, this is just inference on my part, but he was, because he had worked on the atom bomb, because he knew that it was all government financed, because he was from a certain sort of collective kind of mathematical and culture, he didn't think anybody should own the ideas. You know, why would anybody, you wouldn't own the ideas of the atom bomb, why would you own the ideas of the computer? If they were equally important to the future of the world, then you can't own that. This is how I'm inferring that he thought. And so I think he put one over on Eckert and Mauchly with the collaboration or the collusion of Herman Goldstein.
And yet, they do receive patents.
Yeah, they did write up their patents for ENIAC, and they did eventually receive the patents,
Yep.
and they did then build UNIVAC.
And it's clear, as electronic computing takes hold, and Honeywell and Control Data and these other companies are now really beginning to make a market in electronic computing, Sperry Rand begins to assert these Eckert and Mauchly patents.
Well, I have to say, one of the
against the
details
field.
I loved the most about the Eckert and Mauchly saga was that their first investor was the American Totalizer Company, who always at the forefront, you know, the horse racing betting people. They were the ones who were the first ones who saw the possibilities, you know. And so that was one of their first investors.
Yeah. And so we're now at the point where this patent is being challenged. All of these patents are being challenged. This begins in 1958. The patent litigation goes on and on. Atanasoff is not involved initially.
No.
And 7 years into the litigation, a body is found in a hotel room, and it turns out to be Clifford Berry.
It's not a hotel room, though. It was kind of a lodging, an outbuilding.
Right.
Not really a real hotel, though.
And the circumstances of Clifford Berry's death, as it's being investigated, are not clear at all.
No. And there are a lot of ways to look at it. He was found with a plastic bag over his face, and he had died by suffocation. He died by suffocation. His wife went to various doctors and said, is this possible, you know, that he could have killed himself by just putting a plastic bag over his face? And they said no. On the other hand, and she would have said also that he was moving, he was getting a new job, it was a great new job, they were looking at houses. He was enthusiastic about the job and eager to get on with their lives. On the East Coast, he'd been working in Pasadena. And so she believed really to the end of her life that it was not suicide. On the other hand, he had been in a car accident, and he was having a certain amount of pain. So I just, in my book, I just leave that up in the air. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think it's possible to know at this point. But
At
But it galvanized Atanasoff.
I was going to say that at that point, you suggest this was the thing, this was the sort of catalyst that gets Atanasoff involved in the litigation.
Well, you have to see it from Atanasoff's point of view. He's got lots of projects. He's always a forward-thinking person. And anybody, you know, he must have been about my age at this point, a little bit older, and he had moved a lot of times. And, you know, you got to get all those papers out again, and you got to go through them, and where are they? And are they in the garage? Are they in the attic? Are they in the basement? And so he needed something in order to get him moving on exactly how to go about finding the old papers and getting back to the ABC and you know, learning about the new computers and sorting the ideas about what he made and what is now in existence.
And true to form, it turns out he was meticulous
Absolutely.
in keeping notes and papers and documenting all of this work that had been done over 20 years earlier at this point.
Yeah, more, 25, yeah. So he had the papers, and they made sense. He had been meticulous about how he wrote them out, and he was also lucky in that there were people at Iowa State, still at Iowa State, who remembered the circumstances, remembered seeing Mauchly come and visit. He was also lucky in the sense that Mauchly didn't know that Atanasoff was working for, quote unquote, the other side, the non-Sperry side. And so Mauchly called him up and said, "Can I come and talk to you and bring my lawyer?" And Atanasoff said yes, and he and his Alice, his wife, hosted Mauchly and the lawyer. And Mauchly was much too forthcoming. He told Atanasoff and Alice what he thought. You know, he told him what his lawyers had told him to say and what they told him to do and how they told him to talk about it. And basically, they told him to be as forgetful as possible. At least that's what he told Atanasoff.
Well, and to be fair, Mauchly was not a well man at this
No.
point.
No.
He did have a physical and sort of mental condition that made it not probably as possible for him to be have those moments of total recall that Atanasoff is said to have had during 11 days on the stand.
He also didn't have the paperwork.
Right.
To remind him of what he had been thinking or how he had been thinking.
And by the way, by this time Atanasoff had discovered that Iowa State never filed a patent application.
Yes.
So this was the only patent. But that doesn't seem, in your view, to really have driven him. It's not like Atanasoff was crusading to destroy these patents because he...
No, I don't think he was going to profit. He wasn't going to profit. I think what drove him to do this? I think he wanted to get it right. You know, he wanted things to be orderly and right, and he wanted to get it on the record and the stuff that he had done, and and Barry had done. I think he wanted that on the record, and he knew how to get it on the record.
And so he testifies for...
Let me also say that the lawyers Atanasoff was working with were much more organized and methodical and careful than the Sperry lawyers. One of the lawyers was Charles Call, who was 28 years old. And he was really good at not only getting the depositions, but also videotaping testimony, also putting everything on computers so that you could get to it very quickly instead of having it in books, or having it in files. So the lawyers that were working on the Honeywell side were, they were more competent, and they also had more to work with, and they worked well with Atanasoff. Atanasoff basically tested them, do you really know what you're doing, and they won him over, and so then he became quite enthusiastic.
So he testifies
I
for
think
11
that,
days,
I think
right?
that I think that the lawyers on the Sperry side were saying to themselves, how often does a patent in America get
You think?
thrown out? I
Yeah.
think that was in the back of their minds.
So they felt they were going to defend this
They
patent.
felt they
and
were
that
in the
wasn't going to.
dominant position, I think.
So Atanasoff turns out to be a pretty remarkable witness.
Really remarkable. He's, practically a photographic memory with the documentation to back it up.
Testifies for 11 days. And then in 1972, on the same day as the...
October 17th, I think it was, but it was 73.
73, I'm sorry. The court rules that the patents are invalid.
Yes, on the same day as the break-in, the Watergate.
The decision was released in the, Sirica released his...
Yeah, Sirica decision in the
That's right,
Watergate break-in.
yeah.
But who knows that the patent, really, come on. Is this computer patent going to hit the big time newspaper-wise, even if Nixon isn't going down? I don't think so. I think it was a very, very important decision for the industry. But I think in 1973, nobody really knew where the industry was going. It was not that terribly newsworthy.
And what happens to Atanasoff?
Nothing. The case is won, but he doesn't make any money, and he doesn't really gain any fame. And people learn about it and are interested in it, but the exhibitions, like at the Smithsonian, still don't include him.
There is a
And so
new
it's a
exhibition
little
that
bit
does
of
include him,
the-
by
yes.
the way. Yeah.
But these are the old exhibitions.
And it has been called by USA Today the Valley's answer to the Smithsonian. So
Okay. I have to say that when I was doing the research, and I say this right at the beginning of the book, and I went on the MIT inventor's website, he wasn't on the inventor's website. And some woman who invented the hand cycle, I don't even know what a hand cycle is, she's there. So I do think that he got a lot of recognition in the course of, as he got older, including a presidential medal. But, until he's conquered the MIT website, he hasn't really gotten there.
So what is your conclusion about Atanasoff the man? You've looked at the arc of his entire life now. And
I'm glad he wasn't my dad.
yeah.
He would have been really mad at me because I couldn't understand algebra at all. No, I think he was an incredibly dynamic, interesting, and inventive person. One of the great stories is Laura, his first wife, was a wonderful gardener, and on the property they had a big garden, and there were a lot of peas. And Atanasoff wanted to come up with a method for shelling peas, and so he used the dryer, shelling peas through centrifugal force. And, that's the way his mind worked. Here's a problem. Oh, I can figure that out. To me, that's a fascinating thing. And and he had that. We all know people like that. But he had that to an absolutely unusual degree.
Did you ever get a sense in researching this that he was the least bit wistful that patent had
sure.
never been filed, and maybe he thought to himself, I might have been the guy who was gaining commercial fame and making this money?
I don't think, I don't know that was, John Jr. and Tamara can correct me, but I didn't get the feeling that he was motivated by money. I just got the feeling that he was motivated by inquisitiveness
And solving the problem.
and solving the problem. And and that's one of his really admirable characteristics. But his life had a happy ending because he made money, because doing other things.
Yes.
You know, so in some sense, in my 4 theaters, you know, the Atanasoff movie is the one with the happy ending. The Zouza movie is the weird one, but also with a happy ending. But the other 2 movies don't have a happy ending. The Turing movie doesn't have a happy ending. The Flowers movie doesn't have a happy ending. The von Neumann movie doesn't have a happy ending. You know, he died young at 56, probably of cancer induced by his work on the atomic bomb. So, so we all want to be in the movie that has the happy ending.
We have some great questions here. We're going to take a few questions, and then you're going to do a reading. Is the thesis that John von Neumann wanted computers in the public, as you talked about the distribution of this paper that was written at the Moore School, is that new to your book? Is that a new theory?
I don't know, because I didn't see it in the books that I was reading about von Neumann. I inferred it from what I read. But it's not, I'm not going to lay claim to absolute originality. But that's what I inferred, yeah.
What was your biggest surprise or the lesson you learned? Those are 2 very different questions. So maybe you could talk about the lesson you learned and your biggest surprise in working on this.
The lesson I learned was go back to fiction. But, you know,
Really? Why? Say more about that. Why is that?
No, the biggest surprise was how interesting all these characters were, and how even somebody like Tommy Flowers, about whom there is almost nothing, you could still see his personality shining through. You know, 3 pages at the most, 3 or 4 pages of material about Tommy Flowers. Well, a little more than that. But just the things he says about himself, and you know, in the land of the blind, he's the one-eyed man. You know, so that was the greatest thing, was how totally idiosyncratic and interesting they all were.
I think we have a lot of budding writers in the audience tonight, because these are a lot about the craft of writing. So the way you wrote this book, let me ask
We
you
can
just a
have a
few of
couple
these.
of
We have a series of these. Do you approach writing fiction and nonfiction differently?
Absolutely.
And if so, how?
Well, a novel usually comes as a whole, and other novelists have said this. It has its own integrity, and you can push it in certain directions, but it'll push back and bounce back. And so your job is to sort of investigate that whole and learn how to express it. But nonfiction comes in pieces, and as you learn more and more about a given subject, the characteristics of the whole evolve and change. So it's not as weighty in your mind, because it's not pushing back all the time.
So after writing the book, we opened with this question about how did that computer get on your desk? Do you look at the computer on your desk differently now from the way that you looked at it before you started this?
No.
No.
It's
you know-
still kind of a mystery. But I love it, you know.
This is a great question. Was Atanasoff ever bitter that he didn't get enough recognition or formal recognition or be known in history for his role?
Well, that's a question that John and Tamara should answer. You know, I do remember being told, and maybe I read this in Tamara's book. Oh, there you are. Okay. That he wondered where his Nobel Prize was. But maybe that was a joke, because he must have known that there wasn't a category. Was it true? Oh, okay, it was true. He wondered where his Nobel Prize was.
Give a Nobel Prize for computers or software at that time.
Do they now? No.
They did 2 or 3 years ago.
Oh, they did. Oh, okay.
So,
he could
so
have,
he
if
was.
only
It
he'd lived
sounds
longer.
like that his son is saying yes. He
Yeah.
did wonder that.
Yeah, I think he did.
He was nominated 3 or 4 times.
Oh, he was. Okay. That's not something I knew.
Do you?
I'll tell a story at the very end about another mad scientist as a way of advertising my other book, Private Life.
So do that now. Let's talk about your next mad scientist project, and then we all would like to hear you read a passage
okay.
from the book.
Well, I was hoping they would sell bring along a few copies of Private Life, which is the adult novel that I published last spring. And I was sort of writing it alongside the Atanasoff book, which amused me. It was about, as a novelization of the life of my great uncle, Thomas Jefferson Jackson C. How many of you have heard of him? Bob, explain exactly in one word what he was. Physicist. Yeah. Total crackpot. And he viewed himself as Albert Einstein's greatest rival. And he was the last Newtonian physicist, basically. And so when I was out pushing that book, I went to a place where he had worked, which was the Naval Observatory in Washington. And they had lots of stories about him. And this is one of the stories. After my great aunt died in the 1950s, he decided it was time to go and get his Nobel Prize. And so he got his companion, his housekeeper, to go with him, and they went to Oslo to claim for him to claim his Nobel Prize. And he is about 90 at this point. And there was an astronomer there who was a very kind person, and he got all of the astronomers together and the scientists, and they allowed Uncle Tom to give a lecture, which went on for quite a long time. But he didn't get the Nobel Prize. And so a couple of years later, now he was about 94, he decided to come back and try again. And this same very nice man, he knew he wasn't going to get the scientists together to do this again, so he got the janitorial staff to dress up and be very attentive to Uncle Tom's, once again, 3-hour lecture about how Newton was right. And so I was doing this book and Private Life kind of at the same time. And I was really glad that these guys weren't as crazy. But with this kind of audience, there's bound to be several. And so your wives should look at this book. It's called Private Life.
I've asked Jane to read a particular passage from this book because I think it probably is a fair reflection of how you really come down on this whole question about who invented the computer. So could you read that for us?
Sure. Starting here, right?
Yes.
For those of us who aren't mathematicians, inventors, physicists, or engineers, the history of the invention of the computer is a fascinating look at both human history and human character. There was no inventor of the computer who was not a vivid personality, and no two are alike. It is Alan Turing who has captured the imagination of the culture, perhaps because of his brilliant mind and his tragic death. But Konrad Zuse is at least as idiosyncratic, and his life was even more dramatic. Like Atanasoff, he lived until 1995, long enough to be remembered and vindicated too. The most poignant figure in some ways may be Tommy Flowers, who remains largely unsung. But perhaps our most problematic character is John von Neumann, Scott McCartney considers him a thief. Norman McCrae and Cotty Martin consider him a visionary. Everyone considers him a genius. As for me, von Neumann is the man whose memoirs I would have liked to read, the man at the center of everything, the man of Budapest, the man of Washington, D.C. I would like to know who he thought had invented the computer. Thank you.
So we thought it was appropriate to bring John Atanasoff back one more time. So we're going to give the central figure of this book the last word this evening.
Since the beginning, many men have worked on computing, and many have furnished elements that were important. This applies to Mauchly, Eckert, some members of the staff, such as Burks, Braidard, and others. Historically, the list should contain Pascal, Napier, and Zuse. Credit must also go to the originators of our number system, which began computing. What each man accomplishes depends on his brains and energy, but also on the surrounds in which he works. In this, timing is important. Pascal could not have invented electronic digital computing, although his brainpower was overwhelming. In a larger sense, no man invents anything. He builds and extends a little with his friends and on the shoulders of others. Many are quietly involved in making this historical record clearer, and we all should support this effort. I've tried here to make my part in this understandable and to convey some idea of the excitements of the period. Thank you.